Bona tarda, bon vespre. Mira el Jordi. Hola. Bé, hem decidit fer la conferència, tot i jo crec que pels que hem vingut val la pena que la fem. La conferència serà en anglès, llavors jo soc directora de l'escola. Aquesta és una conferència organitzada conjuntament amb el col·legi, al qual donem les gràcies per acollir-nos, i l'escola. L'Escola d'Arquitectura de Barcelona des de fa un mes ha tingut en el vestíbul una exposició comissariada pel Vladimir. Demà la desmuntem, llavors avui representa una mica la conferència de clausura. Llavors, sense menys preàmbuls, jo, si voleu, en anglès us llegiré una mica la biografia del Vladimir i després ell ja introduirà i passarà la conferència. Vladimir Belgolovsky, he was born in 1970s in Ukraine. He's the founder of the New York-based non-profit curatorial project, which focuses on organizing, curating and designing architectural exhibitions worldwide. After graduating from the Cooper Union School of Architecture in 1996, he worked in various architectural offices in Madrid and New York City, including Rafael Viñoli, David Rockwell and Gensler, and headed his own practice, Performa, a studio based in New York and Kolkata, India, until 2009. He's the American correspondent for architectural journals Speech from Berlin and Tatlin, a journal from Moscow, and he's a corresponding member of the International Academy of Architecture in Moscow. His books include Conversations with Architects in the Age of Celebrity from 2015, Harry Siedler, Life Work. He actually did a monography corresponding to the exhibition from Rizzoli, published in 2014, Felix Novikov from 2013 and Tatlin in 2009, Soviet Modernism from 1955-1988, all published in 2010, and Greenhouse, published in 2009. His essay about New York City was included in Great Russian Encyclopedia in the volume 23, and his article Memories of the Subsoil, Russia in Search of Lost Modernity was published in Europe Atlas, Architectures of the 21st Century, Fundación, edited by Luis Fernández Galeano in 2012. And his interview with architect Felix Novikov was featured in the Soviet Modernism 1955-1991 Unknown History. So Belgolovsky, he has curated exhibitions like the one we have now in the school, Harry Siedler Painting Towards Architecture, and other ones, a retrospective of architect Ángel Fernández Alba at the Royal Botanical Gardens in Madrid in 2009, Greenhouse in Moscow in 2009, and Russian Pavilion for the foreign section at the 11th Venice Biennale, Architectural Biennale in 2008. He has also lectured at Columbia University, Pennsylvania University, Virginia, Hong Kong, Moscow Architectural Institute, Architecture in Vienna, University of Palermo and Buenos Aires, South Wales, Sydney, Tongji University in Shanghai, and other universities, museums, and architectural centers in Argentina, Australia, Azerbaijan, Brazil, Bulgaria, Canada, China. You have a very, very long CV in terms of lecturing, very good. Turkey and United States. So sorry for me being very fast on his description. Thanks, Vladimir. Actually, I just use this moment of public, even with this small public, but committed public, to thank you for everything, to bring the exhibition into our school, into Barcelona, to be able for us to know such a, maybe I think quite an unknown architect here in Barcelona, an architect that represents the modernity, especially in Australia, and it was for me quite a discovery, so I appreciate and I really thank you for that, and let's hope that we will enjoy your lecture. Thanks a lot for everything.
you can hear me much better now, right? Okay, thank you. Yeah, I was actually very pleasantly surprised. Just before the lecture, I went downstairs to the bookstore and I saw the book on Harry Siedler. So it's available. I hope you, if not going to buy it, at least you can go through it. And hopefully you had a chance to see the exhibition. The exhibition ending today. Tomorrow we're going to dismantle and go to the next venue, which is Budapest. And it's already scheduled for next year as well. So Harry Siedler is a very obscure architect. I think it makes sense to examine his work, his career, his even life story. I think we can learn so much from this architect. I have to say that I first discovered him not long ago. When I was a student, I never heard of him. When I graduated and worked for years in architectural offices and wrote criticism on architecture, still never heard of him. It was only 2010 when I discovered him for the first time, and that was right before going to Australia. I met for lunch with a friend, Emilio Ambas, a very well-known architect in New York. And he, upon learning that I was going to Australia, told me that I have to see the work of Harry Siedler. At that time, he was no longer around. He died in 2006. And I went to Australia. I was invited to represent another Spanish architect, Ángel Fernández Alba, whose exhibition went to Adelaide in South Australia, and he asked me to represent the exhibition and to give a talk on Spanish architecture. And so for me, it was an opportunity to go to Sydney and see two things. One was to see the Opera House, and the second one to meet the widow of Harry Siedler. And when I met her, it was in the house. We're going to see that house in this presentation. This was his house, and I would say mid-career kind of manifesto of his architecture. And after showing this house, the widow, Penelope Siedler, I had a chance to explain a little bit of what I do, and I asked her, do you think it would be nice to have an exhibition on the work of your husband, you know, a small exhibition in Sydney, perhaps in a lobby of one of his buildings? And she just smiled and said, well, I guess it would be nice, but why don't you do a world tour? And so from that point, this was 2010, that became a major project for me. And it started in 2012, at the end of 2012, and it's still traveling. And it went to 17 different cities around the world, and now it's in Barcelona. So here you can see Harry Siedler as a very young person. He's only 27 years old, but already quite accomplished figure. He's standing on the ramp of the house that he just completed. It's a house for his mother. This is 1950. He just finished a couple of houses, but he's already a very well-known, famous, young, famous, very ambitious architect, because this house became the very first modern house in Australia. Uncompromisingly modern house in Australia. It became very well published, and he came to Australia just for that commission. He's not Australian. He was asked by his mother, and we'll talk about how his mother got to Australia. But anyway, his intention was to be practicing architecture in New York, but just to go to Australia to build this particular house. But it became such a success that he never left Australia, stayed there for almost 60 years, and became Australia's most distinguished, prominent architect of the 20th century. When I went to Sydney and saw some of his work, I was really impressed with three things. So one was the quality of his work. And the second was the quantity of his work, because he just built so many buildings. And the third, I already mentioned the fact that I never ever heard of him. So I don't know if you ever heard of him, but hopefully you will learn something. The name of this presentation and the name of the exhibition is Painting Toward Architecture, and it's not an original name. This is the name of an article that Harry Siedler wrote, the very first article that he wrote when he came to Australia. That was in 1948. And that was also not an original title. That title came from the title of this book, Painting Toward Architecture by Henry Russell Hitchcock. This is the book that showed numerous examples of how architecture can be inspired by art. So this is an idea which I think is very important today, because, and I will probably mention this in the course of the talk, I think there is a diversion going on between architecture and art currently, and we no longer get inspired by art. But this particular book from 1948, that showed many different examples of where architects can get their inspiration. And that was the preoccupation of Harry Siedler most of his life. So here you can see some of the incredible examples of his work, built not only all over Australia, basically well, Australia doesn't have many cities, but in practically every city he built something. And he also built in a number of different countries. And here you have skyscrapers, 60, 50, 40, 50 stories tall buildings. For example, here you can see Australian Embassy in Paris, a project on which he collaborated with Marcel Breuer. And this is Grosvenor Place in Sydney, almost 50 stories tall building. So you can see this incredible architecture. And here is a quote from Harry Siedler. It's a kind of dictum that as soon as he came to Australia, he put this up in his office. He said, Australia's present-day building practices are outdated. This was a 20-something guy who never built anything. Came to Sydney, rented a studio apartment, and half of the studio became his office. He was the only employee of that office. And he says, they cry about Australian architecture. They cry out for rejuvenation. It is the policy of this office. So he referred to this little tiny space from which he started his practice. To create new standards which will produce a progressive contemporary architecture. So you can see he was very ambitious, but not groundless, because you can see what he has built over time. And these are all different examples just in Sydney. So in Sydney alone, he built over 70 projects, so 70 buildings, and overall he designed over 200 projects, and about 160 got built. So Sydney is a big city, but in a number of places you can definitely say Sydney is Siedler City, because his work is very distinguished, and there is a lot of it in the city. So for example, you can see here a Grosvenor Place building, and right behind Australia Square, that's another of his building, 50 stories tall building, and a 60 stories tall building, MLC Center. Both of these buildings, when they were built, they were world's tallest building built of lightweight concrete. And here's another picture of the same building. Also, Australia Square is on the left, and there is another building across the street, Cove Apartment, another over 40 stories tall building. built already in late 90s by Siedler. And here's another image where you can see Australia Square, MLC, and another building that he built in the early 60s, and another compound of 3 buildings. And in the first one, this is where his office was located. And this compound was built out of 3 buildings. So the first one was built in the 70s, the second one in the 80s, and the third was built in the 90s. And the one that was built the first, the upper 2 floors, this is where the office is, and next door, 2 uppermost floors is where there is an adjacent penthouse where the office would organize all kinds of events. And to this day, the family owns these 3 buildings. And the practice, in fact, the practice is still going on. And it's a small practice. It used to be at one point over 40 people, 45 people, and now it's about 5 people. And, but they continue practicing architecture. And here's, you have a picture of Harry Siedler when he was just 17 years old. And he was born in 1923 in Vienna, which is quite important for his story. And in 1938, when he was just 15 years old, this was the time when Hitler occupied Vienna, annexed Austria, and Harry was born into middle class, upper middle class Jewish family. So for Jews, there was only one way to survive, was to get out of Austria. And it wasn't easy, and as you know, a lot of Austrian Jews perished in the war and Holocaust. But he was lucky because his older brother at the time was studying photography in London, and he arranged for Harry to come to England. He arranged for visa, and soon after the parents followed. And in 1940, so from 1938 to 1940, the family was in England, and in 1940, when Winston Churchill became the new Prime Minister of Britain, one of the first things he did in the first few days of him becoming Prime Minister, he interned Austrian citizens and German citizens because of the war, because of the war with Germany, and all the citizens of Austria and Germany became enemy aliens. And Harry and his brother were interned, and eventually they were put on a ship and shipped to Canada. And near Quebec, they were imprisoned. And he was at that time almost 17, 18 years old. His brother was 21 and a half. And at that time, there was a law that would allow younger people until they were 21 to apply to universities and get out of the camps. So he at that time already knew that he wanted to study architecture, and because he met some of the architects in the camp, and he applied to 3 different universities and was accepted by one of them, Manitoba University in Winnipeg. And in fact, his portfolio was so good that he was immediately accepted to the 3rd year. And I didn't say, this is the picture of the factory, textile factory of his father and 2 of the father's brothers, 2 uncles. And you can see that in 1938 it was taken over by Hitler. And so they actually were able to smuggle some of the equipment, and one of their uncles was able to immigrate to Australia and reestablish his business, and that's why Harry's parents eventually made it to Australia. And when Harry was a student in Manitoba, he read this very important book, Space, Time and Architecture by Gideon, published in 1941. So he read it just a couple of years later. And in that book, he learned about Walter Gropius, who was the founder of the Bauhaus. He immigrated during the war, before the war, to the United States, and he became, since late 30s, he became the dean of Harvard School of Design. And Harry's intention was to go to Harvard and study under Gropius. And that's exactly what he did. And in fact, he applied to Harvard in 1945. It was a little bit late. They already had a quota for that year, 15 students. It was all fulfilled. But Gropius saw the work of Harry Siedler, and just by looking at the work, he said, we have to accept this young person because it seems like he seems to be the most talented person this year. And this was, in fact, an incredible year full of very talented students who later became very famous architects. And the person who was a classmate of Harry facing us with his back in this west, that's Ian Pei. Ian Pei was Harry Siedler's classmate at Harvard. And Gropius was a kind of person that inspired young men. It wasn't just about architecture, it was all about changing the world. And Harry Siedler became a kind of disciple, missionary of modern architecture, not just architecture, but modern way of life, new ideas transforming the world. And that was instilled into him and many of his classmates and the whole generation by Gropius. And this is one of the very earliest examples of modern architecture. You have to imagine that in the 1940s, mid-1940s, there was no really modern architecture to just go around and see. Even on the east coast of the United States, like in New York City, it was mainly built as very experimental, small residential houses, which you couldn't really visit. So Gropius, with his partner, Burle, because at some point they were practicing together, they built this house for Gropius. And you can see that this house is not really, it's an explosion of a box, so to speak. And this house is not really built on any ideas of traditional architecture. There is no such precedent that could inspire this kind of architecture. It really came from modern art. And so you can see a painting by Mondrian, which came later than this house was designed, but it's a kind of painting that would inspire this kind of project. And this was very close to Harvard, this house, and Gropius would invite his students for an afternoon tea on Saturdays and Sundays. And this was, for many of the students, was the very first time when they would encounter really early examples of modern architecture in America. It wasn't really possible to see in anywhere else. And when Harry was at Harvard, so he studied under Gropius. He also met Marcel Breuer, and we'll talk about Marcel Breuer. And then he graduated in 1945, and in 1945 he was a kind of a complete architect by that time, but he still had a lot of questions. And the questions were, why do you think, he asked Gropius, why do you think this shape is better than that shape? Why do you think this color is better than that color? And surprisingly, we still don't know the answer. And Gropius didn't know the answer. But he said, you know, you should go to Black Mountain College. and take a course of Joseph Albers, the painter, and he knows the answers. So Joseph Albers had this incredible theories about colors and shapes, and he was running his course. And to become his student, you had to get a paper from somebody who was important. There was no real exam to get in. And Gropius was important, so Gropius gave that letter to Harry Siedler. And he took a course. And here you see one of the paintings. Joseph Albers was a very, very famous, important painter of the 20th century, very experimental, very well known, also an immigrant coming from Germany. And he was known for his very famous series of about 2,000 paintings, homage to the square, which he already started in America. So he was very, very experimental. And here you have a painting called Repetition Against Blue from 1943. And you can see how about half of the painting is repeated. So he was really preoccupied with, with shapes and colors and reverse symmetry and repetition, which also very much intrigued Siedler. And you can see here there is another painting from 1943 called Study for Vice Versa. It's really a print. This print eventually, because Siedler became really fascinated with modern art and he started collecting paintings and prints that he liked. So this is in his, he had a very similar painting. And you can see how a painting starts to affect his architecture. You can see it in plans, you can see it in facades. Early on, this is one of his very first houses, 1950. So you can see the immediate, very literal, sometimes, relationship between art and architecture. And here you see a famous Albers Gold Rosa painting from 1926 and the facade of Harry Siedler's earliest, one of the earliest buildings, and you can see the pattern of the windows almost directly is getting inspiration from the painting. And what's interesting about Harry Siedler is that he would never just take a painting and transfer it into architecture, because he was also a very rational architect, and for him everything had to have a reason. And what's fascinating about the time that he was building this, he was designing this building, at that time you could not design a glass building. There was a very conservative fire code, so you had to have a 1 meter separation of solid concrete or brick material in between the glass. So you couldn't have a glazed facade of the entire building. And so this solution worked very well with the very conservative fire code and with his inspirations in art. And here is another work. This is a skyscraper that was never built in Melbourne, and its plan is very much rooted in patterns and studies of Albers, another Albers painting. And so going back to Marcel Breuer, Marcel Breuer was one of the key influences on Harry Siedler. So they met at Harvard in 1945, and then Harry graduated, went to Black Mountain College, he went to Canada, got his license, and then in 1946 he went back to New York, ready to start his career working for somebody in New York as an architect. And he was extremely lucky because exactly at that time, Marcel Breuer decides to stop teaching at Harvard and go to New York and open his practice. And that moment just coincided. And Harry found out about this and ran to Marcel Breuer's house. He didn't even have a studio at that time. And he begged him to hire Harry. Breuer was not really ready at that time. He didn't have projects. He didn't really have a studio. He didn't have a single employee. But he couldn't pay. But Harry was very persistent. He said, you don't have to pay me. You are the best architect in the world. I want to learn from you. And Harry became his very first employee. And for 2 years, from 1946 to 1948, Harry worked for Breuer on this kind of projects. These houses by Breuer, and most of these houses Harry worked on. He did construction drawings, design drawings for these houses. And you can see a lot of features, very much Breuer features. So you have very deep cantilevers, you have a large expanse of glass, vertical siding, industrial materials such as metal pipes. You have slanted or butterfly roof, then privacy partitions, then extended low walls into the landscape, and then on the inside, freestanding, very sculptural fireplaces and display niches, and even the choice of furniture. You can see some of the furniture a lot of the furniture was designed by Breuer, and then also by Sarin and Eames. And this became the language of Harry Siedler. He really wanted to embrace it. So when we see the work of Siedler later on, especially on a smaller scale, you'll see that there is a very strong relationship between Siedler and Breuer. But what's interesting about Breuer is that he wasn't really trained as an architect, surprisingly, as a number of greatest architects of the 20th century. So he was very experimental. He really designed a number of his pieces of his architecture as furniture pieces. So you can see these extreme cantilevers, cantilevers that could not really work. This is the house that he designed for himself. This is his personal house. So he, in this particular case, went really overboard, and he really risked, the limits. He pushed the limits in this house. So as soon as this house was finished, it started sagging. It's a very famous example. And eventually, almost as soon as these pictures were taken, 2 brick walls were built to keep this cantilevered house from falling down. So there was a wall built here and a wall built here, which completely compromised not only the visuals of the house, but even the name of the house. It's no longer a cantilever house. It's known as a cantilever house, and it's known for these photographs, but no longer today it looks like this. And Harry, this is 1948, so Harry was in fact working on this particular house. And he did have conversation with Breuer, because Harry had a very strong, well-rounded education, not only as an architect, but also engineering. He took engineering courses. So he knew this was going to fail. But Breuer, still wanted to push it. It would fail because most of these elements, it's all wood. So you can imagine how difficult for this house to be in this position for a long time. So Siedler was really learned from Breuer, but also managed to build structures that were not really, pushing too far. He knew where to stop short, and he really was the master of his structure. And here you see, so from 1946 to 48, he was working for Breuer. And in 1946, after the war, his parents managed to leave England, leave Europe, and immigrate to Australia, where Harry's uncle re-established the business, family business. And from 1946 to 1948, they got back very quickly on their feet, became again quite successful in business, and Harry's mother was ready to build a house. And from 1946 to 1948, she would constantly write letters to Harry. When are you coming to Australia? We miss you so much. When are you coming to Australia? And he would always respond, why in the world I would go to Australia when I live in the best city in the world, New York City. I work for the best architect in the world. I'm not coming. And then eventually in 1948, in the beginning of the 48, she sent a letter, business-like short letter, asking him, okay, you don't want to come to Australia as a visitor. Would you come to Sydney to design and build us a house? And that finally persuaded him to go to Australia. And he said two conditions. So one condition was, you have to pay for my ticket. And the second condition, I want to come to Australia via Brazil. So why Brazil? Because at that time, Brazil was one of the leading countries in contemporary architecture, and Oscar Niemeyer was already one of the most important architects in the world, and Harry wanted to meet him and travel there and possibly work for Niemeyer. So he went to Australia via Brazil and traveled in South America, studied and worked with Niemeyer. And in fact, you will see later that he was also influenced by Niemeyer very, very much. And here on the left side, you can see this is the house that Harry finally built. So his mother asked him to design a house in 1948, and in 1950 the house was ready. But more than just one house. He built 3 houses for the extended family, for his brother and his uncle, on the same site. The swimming pool was never finished, but all 3 houses were all finished in 1 year. And when they were finished, it was just a splash. It became instantly, he instantly became famous and successful. And Australia never seen this kind of architecture with flat roofs on stilts, painted white boxes. So everybody was fascinated. Everybody came. His mother has to, in fact, leave the house for weekends because it was just impossible. There were so many visitors constantly knocking on at the glass, trying to see this, because Australia was really, really isolated. You had to make 7 stopovers to get to Australia at that time because this was before the jet era. And it was quite expensive to go to Australia, so nobody went there and very few people traveled there. So anyway, what's interesting about these 3 houses is that when he finally finished these 3 houses, they became more like a showroom kind of space. Look what I can do. All 3 houses were quite different, and a lot of people came, a lot of middle-class European immigrants came to see it, and everybody wanted a house like that. So he couldn't leave. He just got so many commissions, and he never left Australia for that reason. This house has, however, a very interesting story. This is the model that was done for this exhibition, which is now Travels, which is now here. And this is the original model. What's interesting about this is that when Harry was working for Marcel Breuer, his colleague Roland Thompson, who also worked for Breuer, wanted to build a house, and together they designed the house for in the U.S. and the house for Roland Thompson's family, and that house was never finished. So when the mother asked Harry to design a house, he decided to build this particular house, which was not built in the U.S. So he brought his drawings, he brought this model, and immediately when he was greeted by his brother at the airport, he said, here's the model, this is the house I want to build here, let's go find the site. And they drove around Sydney and found a site very similar to the site for which it was designed. So that publication was done, it was published, that house, before the mother ever asked the house. And here's the house. And you can see we just went through all the different elements of Breuer's architecture, and you can see all of them here. But the composition is quite different. You can see that it's influenced also by Le Corbusier, by Breuer. Breuer definitely, you know, even details are very Breueresque, very much. But the ramp is somewhat coming from Le Corbusier, the stilts. But there is something different here, and that's the mural. And that's the influence that he picked up in South America. So every time he worked for somebody or met somebody or collaborated, there was another influence that he would pick up. So this is one of the Breuer's, it's a Robinson house. It's a house on which Siedler worked. And you can see the similarities. Breuer invented something that was called binuclear plan. So the house was divided into night zone and day zone. So you can see here, this is where the bedrooms are, and this is where the living spaces, and there is a kind of separation in between. So it's a very similar layout. And here you can see this mural. So it's very similar to the work of Paolo Wernick. So the mural was designed by Harry Siedler himself, and it was painted by him. And apparently there isn't even a sketch for this. He claimed that he just did it, and did it personally by himself. But in any case, you can see the influence by Paolo Wernick, who worked for Oscar Niemeyer. So this is a famous Pampuya church, and this is another this is another project by MMM Roberto in Rio de Janeiro, and that's a lobby by also Wernick. So you can see a very similar language. And so for a number of years, 10, 15 years, Harry designed many houses for middle class and upper middle class Australians, very similar to what he designed for his own family. And then in mid-1960s, he had a chance to design his own house. So this became a kind of manifesto, mid-career manifesto. You see a painting on the left, and that's a painting by Theo van Dasburg done in the year Siedler was born, 1923. In fact, this was the most, this was a favorite work of art by Harry Siedler. And when he was in his early 70s, about 70 years old, his wife located this painting and purchased it and gave it to Harry for his birthday. And then when he died, after he died already in 2006, a few years later, the widow of Harry Siedler donated this painting to Australian art gallery, National Art Gallery. And it is this particular painting that I was also very intrigued by. And the idea for the exhibition that is now presented at the school is to transform the space into this particular painting. And we had an exhibition last year in Sydney where we tried very effectively also to transform the space into this particular painting. And this painting came to Sydney from Canberra, from the capital. And it was shown in the space with the exhibition. And here you can see that the house is, again, it's not really based on any kind of precedent of architecture, of historical architecture. It's based on a work of art just like this. So it's a kind of interlocking volumes and planes of bricks and glass and concrete. That became the frame of the house that holds the spaces. And so this is the section of the house. when you come to Siedler's houses, you never really see the house as a complete work of architecture. There is no front facade. It's usually you arrive from the back. And here, when you come from the top of the hill, which is here, you first encounter the garage. And the garage is very sculptural. It's half of it is overhanging over the side. So you park your car, then you take down this stair, and then you come around and enter the building through the bridge. And you kind of enter through the back of the house because the front is on the other side. And so you go down, you come to the bridge, and you enter the building almost like a castle. And the house is a very large house. It's about 400 square meters. And you can imagine it as a two-level house. But what he did, he split it in the middle and then shifted the levels, and it became 4.5 levels house with the space kind of light well in the middle. Very dynamic space with kind of unenclosed spaces and vistas. So only the bedrooms were like enclosed spaces, and the rest was all, the space was just floating from level to level. And you can see the interior of the space, again, very much elements of Breuer, but the composition is very strong and quite unique to Siedler. And what's interesting about the house is that it became, when it was built, it was a much bigger house than the apartment where the family lived in the past. And that was an opportunity for Harry to start a collection. He really liked to collect modern art, and the house gave this opportunity to really display the collection. And this is the kind of art that went into it. So you can see, this is very important. This is the work by American sculptor Norman Carlberg, who is still alive. He is in his mid-80s, living in Baltimore. And he is preoccupied with a kind of modular geometry, modular structures. And it's hard to imagine, but if you look at this piece, this is positive, and this is negative of the same thing. And these are 3 units, so it's a negative, positive, negative. And then the same is here, it's a positive, and this is negative. And it's always the same geometry. It's the repetition of a quadrant and circles, but mainly a quadrant. And here's a work by Charles Perry, another American abstract expressionist sculptor who died in 2011. And this is, of course, Frank Stella, who at that time in the 60s, late 60s, was very much preoccupied with modular geometry you know, again, quadrants and semicircles. And what's, you know, the consistency is that he was really fascinated all his life by the work of Albers, and both Carlberg and Perry were students of Albers, so that was the connection. And then Stella wasn't, but Stella was at one particular point in his career preoccupied with the same geometry. The word I was looking for, protractors. So these paintings were done from about 1968 to 1971. Stella did about 100 paintings based on a protractor. And, you know, protractor is just a semicircle and a line. And so it's a lot of variations with the colors and overlapping semicircular lines, and that became very much the influence on Siedler. And we're going to see a lot of examples of that later. This is one of the most important buildings that Siedler did. This is Australia Square. It's called a square because it's on a plaza. It has its own plaza. It's a freestanding building, but the building is cylindrical. And it was built right in the very center of the city. The developer, Dick Dusseldorp, purchased over 30 lots and cleared the space, and the project became the plaza, the tall building, and mid-rise building. And so it's a very idealistic kind of project. The developer was very, very ambitious, and with a very ambitious architect, and the architect wanted to make a real statement and a kind of masterpiece. So, for example, this was the first time he contacted Pierre-Louis Generve, a very famous Italian engineer and architect, and it's Nervi who is responsible for this crisscrossing ribs in the ceiling of the first two floors, and the 20 exterior columns that very elegantly taper to show that the columns in the bottom, in fact, carry much greater weight compared to the columns at the top. So the building is very rational. It's a kind of building that doesn't really have a facade. It shows how it's built. It shows its bones. And what else? It became really the first symbol of modernity in Australia. It was finished before the Opera House. It was finished in late 1960, 1967. And this is the plaza. And here you can see similarities of the work of Pierre-Louis Generve and this particular building. So this is the ceiling on the ground floor and the first floor. So it's not just designed. It's expressing the natural forces of the structure. So it's very beautiful, and yet that's how nature behaves. And then every other floor, it has this kind of spiky plan of 20 beams supported by 20 columns. And cylinder became a kind of idealized figure because it's a very economical way of building. It has a very small number of diverse elements. So there are many elements are exactly the same beams, the same columns. So it went up very quickly. And also it encloses the maximum, because of the nature of the circle, it encloses maximum square footage in a minimum perimeter, in this case circumference. And originally when the building was built, in the lobby and throughout the building, Siedler collaborated with a number of artists, and there was a tapestry designed by Le Corbusier that was put in, and eventually it had to be replaced. And when Siedler was still alive in 2003, when the tapestry was replaced, he was asked to modernize the lobby, and he collaborated with Sol Levitt, another very famous American artist who did this round mural. And this is a very famous cross blades stabile by Alexander Calder. So that has another story. That project really became a number of collaborations between Siedler and artists and engineers and many others. And there was a conversation between Harry Siedler and the developer when Siedler said, well, we are building the symbol of modernity, the absolutely this stunning building. We absolutely have to have a great sculpture in front of it. And then he said that I wouldn't settle for anything less than the best in the world. He was really ambitious. And the developer asked, so where do you get the most beautiful sculpture in the world? And Harry said, well, obviously, you have to go around the world to find it. And he convinced the client to go on a round the world trip with his wife to look for the sculpture. So they visited the most famous sculptors that were working at that time, like Noguchi and Henry Moore and Calder. And they settled on Calder because that particular work was, Harry saw it as a perfect kind of fusion of technology and art. And the work was specifically designed for the structure, for the building. It wasn't just purchased. Here's another very important building in Canberra. It's a government building, and you can see how modern architecture really is different from what it is today. It's a kind of architecture that really tells you from up front what's inside, how it's built. You can see that there is a staircase inside this tower. It's all expressed. And it's also very economical structure. For example, all of these rectangular parts are built based on just the repetition of three elements. There is one kind of column and two kinds of beams, cross beams and longitudinal beams. So it's a very expressive but very simple way of construction. And here you see the plan of this building. If I didn't tell you that it was a plan of a building, you could probably think that it's an abstract painting. It's an incredible work of art with a repetition of, again, the same kind of geometry, semicircles, quadrants, squares, etc. And this has to do with another artist who we already mentioned, Norman Carlberg, who was obsessed with the repetition of the quadrants. And this was an interesting collaboration. In this particular building, there are two sculptures by Carlberg, one made of steel and the other one made of concrete. And they are based on the repetition of two elements. One is turned left, one is turned right. And this one is very simple. It's a quadrant, extruded, and then repeated 16 times into a shape of a kind of ceremonial portal. What's incredible is that this is precisely the same geometry on which the architecture is based. And in fact, in the exhibition, there is an original letter written by Harry Siedler to Norman Carlberg, who Norman Carlberg gave me this letter for the exhibition. And it says that this was written in late 60s, and Siedler says that I can't forget this incredible sculptures that you showed me last time we saw each other. And then he includes in the letter images of the model of the projects that he was working on at the time, and he says, look, I used to have this orthogonal straight lines architecture before I met you, and now look at my buildings. They have curves and semicircles and quadrants. So Harry Siedler, right there in that letter, recognizes the origins of his inspirations. And here is Australian Embassy. It's a very challenging triangular site, very close to the Eiffel Tower. You can see how, again, there are two quadrants. One is a chancellery building, and the other is a residential part for the diplomats. This is a building which is, if you look at the map, just outside of the map, this is where the UNESCO building is in Paris. And here's a photograph of the UNESCO building, and you can see people who were responsible for this project. Pierre-Louis Genervy is in the center, and Marcel Breuer is at the center, and this is Pierre-Louis Genervy. They were the people who were involved in building the UNESCO building 20 years before the Australian embassy. And when Siedler came to Paris, he asked Breuer to be his local architect for the embassy. And Pierre-Louis Genervy became the engineer for the same building. Why Breuer? Breuer was an American architect, but ever after he built the UNESCO building, he kept his Paris office and did many, many projects in France. So he became the local architect for Siedler. And this is some of the incredible elements of this building in Paris, obviously designed with the help of Pierre-Louis Genervy. So this is Pierre Cachere that holds the second story structure. And here's the plan. And you can see the origin of this plan. You can see these two quadrants, and they are the idea for a number of projects. None of these projects were realized, but it was the same idea. He used the same prefabricated beams that he not only used as a straight line, but he also curved them. And in fact, all of these elements are the same, and just the space in between changes. So this could be achieved very economically. And you can see where this is all coming from. So this is, these are a couple of paintings by Frank Stella from the Protractor series. So this is, this is the Australia embassy in Paris. Not exactly, but you can, as an architect, you can see this is the origin of the plan. And there were many, many influences on Siedler architecture. So you can see these are diagrams for 27 different paintings by Stella of his Protractor series from 67, 68, 69, 70. And many of these elements you can find in Harry Siedler's work. And these are plans. So this one is the government offices in Canberra, which is really kind of a cathedral kind of mother board, mother kind of project that encompasses many of the projects that came later. You can really see and find many of the elements and complete plans of Harry Siedler buildings that were designed much later, 20, 30 years later. And this is from the 70s. And here you can see 21 different diagrams for many different buildings that Harry Siedler did based on the same idea. So this is Australian Embassy, 2 quadrants. And you can see how similar ideas were used in other projects. And this is a project of Shell headquarters in Melbourne. So again, it's a quadrant, and this is not a complete quadrant, making kind of question mark. So an incredible consistency. And here you can see it kind of spelled out. So you can see this is a Stella painting. A diagram for one of the Stella paintings is completely repeated on one of the facades in Melbourne. And then this element is in the plan, and this element can be found in the section. These 2 buildings were not built. And then you can see where these ideas are coming from Francesco Borromini. And in fact, Borromini was first discovered by Harry Siedler in that very first book, Space-Time and Architecture by Gideon. This is where there is a whole chapter on Baramini's work. And when Harry Siedler first started going to Rome, collaborating with Pierluigi Nervi, he rediscovered Baramini by going to many churches by Baramini in Rome. And San Carlo alle Quattro Fontane, that's the plan. So that was a way for Baramini to express kind of hidden messages and hidden meaning of architecture, which is not apparent, but the architect knew, the god knew. And so it's very similar ideas you can find in Harry Siedler's work. It may not be apparent, but it's all based on this very rigorous geometry. And here's another example, Grosvenor Place. Again, it's 2 quadrants. And here is 3 works by Siedler, a building which was not built, a painting by Stella, and a unit of a sculpture by Norman Carlberg. And here are 2 projects that Harry Siedler did in Hong Kong. Only the one on the right was realized. This is a very famous project, Hsbc Bank. It was a competition by invitation. 6 architects were invited. Norman Foster won the competition in 1979. And this was a competition run by the bank, and the chairman of the bank was really in love with Harry's work. He traveled to see the work of all 6 architects around the world. He came to see Harry and Penelope in Sydney, and they had a wonderful dinner in their house. And so anyway, when Harry lost the competition, he was really sorry. And he personally called Siedler and he said, sorry about the bank. Would you like to do a club? And this became another project. It's a commission. So the same chairman, the same person was the president of Hong Kong Club, very prestigious, very traditional club in the heart of Hong Kong. And it's a much smaller project, but it became a commission. So, and these projects are very close. Hong Kong Club is right next to Hsbc Bank. So if you've ever been to Hong Kong, this is Statue Square, so this is right at the heart of Hong Kong, and you see the shadow of this building. This is Norman Foster's shadow from Hsbc. So, and this is City Hall. So it's right, this building is right next to each other. And the club is in the lower 4 floors, and this is where the entry is, and on the other side the entry is into the offices which they rent out, so the upper floors are all taken by the offices. And you can see this is half of the typical beam on the facade, and you can see that it seems to be like a very expressive and very sculptural designed element, but in fact it's very rational, and it does exactly what it needs to be doing as far as the sculpture, as far as the structure. So you can see that this is the shape that works best in cross section in the middle of the span, and that's what works best in shear. So it was always this building was already designed after Pierluigi Nervi died, but Siedler collaborated with one of the engineers who used to work for Pierluigi Nervi, and all major projects were done in collaboration with Nervi, or somebody who used to work for Nervi. And this is an interesting sculpture called S sculpture by Charles Perry. So this is the sculpture that stands in Sydney in front of MLC building, which is a 60-story tall building. But what's interesting about the sculpture is that it looks again very expressive, very flamboyant, but in fact it's a modular sculpture. So it's a triangle in section and a quadrant in plan, and it's the same element which is repeated, and you can make up many different variations of the same, based on the same modular. And you can see that inside of Hong Kong Club, it looks pretty much like the sculpture as well. So its sculptural aspect is always in Harry's work. And this is Harry with Charles Perry. Charles Perry was trained as an architect, and he worked for American giant SOM. But he also won a Rome Prize, and after that became a sculptor and collaborated with many architects throughout his career. And over his career, he did over 100 major size sculptures in front of major projects all around the world. And again, look at this sculpture. This is a very fascinating piece. It's made up of just one element. It's a repetition of just one element, which is a semicircle, and there is nothing else here. Just there is another red line to see that. So it's made into a kind of cubic shape, but it's a repetition of just one wire, semicircular wire. And then when you talk about Harry's work, there is always a new name that pops up. There is always a new influence. And as soon as you say it was Breuer, you're going to discover that there is another person that influenced him as much, like Albers or Stella or someone else. And here is the work of Roberto Burle Marx, who Harry encountered in Brazil, who collaborated with Oscar Niemeyer. So this is a famous painting, which is a plan for the roof of this gallery right next to, so it's the same project, right next to the, it's a part of Ministry of Education in Rio de Janeiro. So you can see how this kind of frivolous, kind of very dynamic plan, you'll see how that affected Siedler as well. And this is the most famous project by Roberto Burle Marx. It's Copacabana Beach. So now you can see in the work of Harry Siedler a very clear imprint of Roberto Burle Marx in the landscapes in front of his buildings. This is a building in Brisbane, and this is a building in Perth, major skyscrapers in the cities. And this is the last project I want to show you. And again, you can see very distinct Roberto Burle Marx kind of language in between the architecture. This is a very unusual project. It's built in Vienna, the city where Siedler was born, grew up, had to leave. And as many Viennese, he never thought he would go ever back to Austria. But in 1990, he was invited by the mayor of the city, and he was given a very prestigious award, gold medal of Vienna. And as he was given this award, he was told by the Burgermeister, by the mayor, that we should find you something here to work as an architect, a project. And very soon after, he was commissioned to do this incredible project, which became the biggest project of his career. So it was like a full circle for Harry. And this was a very interesting site right next to the river, Danube. And this is where a highway used to run. It's still there. Oh, sorry, not here. It was right here, right where the buildings are. So the highway was closed, put underground, and on the roof on the covering of the highway, Harry was given the chance to build this buildings. And in the beginning, the city of Vienna gave him very straightforward kind of idea for how the buildings have to be placed very regularly, perpendicularly to the riverfront. But this is the kind of sketch that he returned to them, which looks very kind of irrational and flamboyant, expressive. But in fact, it's very rational. These are existing buildings, taller buildings, very close to the site. So he wanted to maximize the viewing corridors over the river. And that determined the angles for these towers, and also the angles were such that every apartment was given a river view. And also another reason, he located these buildings on angles, so it was easier for the structure to hold these buildings over the highway. And in this particular project, he also collaborated with Linn Utzon. Linn Utzon is the daughter of Jørn Utzon, a very well-known artist based in Copenhagen. So he always collaborated with artists. Oh, and a little bit about the exhibition. This is how the exhibition started in Tallinn. This was a very large architectural museum. Then it went to Riga. It was shown in the oldest stone building in the city, 800-year-old cathedral building. So the idea was to keep the central aisle free and show the entire space immediately as you enter the building. And this was at the University of Virginia. And this went to Brazil, was shown in 3 cities in Brazil. This is in Sao Paulo, in a very gallery-like space. This was in a smaller city, Vitoria, where it was possible to do it in a kind of cultural, commercial space where there was unused room available, and we could really, with no money, but we could convert it into a kind of wide gallery box space and experiment with, presenting all the material kind of floating in the space. And this is in Buenos Aires at another school, Universidad de Palermo, where it was a very vertical space. This was actually done, all of these exhibitions were done before the exhibition was redesigned. It was downsized, and I introduced the color to reflect the idea of painting transforming into architecture. So this was before the color was introduced. And this was a special exhibition in Sydney. This is when we first used the original title, Painting Toward Architecture. And the idea here, nobody picked it up, but the idea was to kind of stretch an imaginary white canvas, and people would enter the gallery almost like entering the canvas and coming into the space, and they would see an original Frank Stella painting to see what kind of world to expect on the inside. And this was an unusual exhibition because we had a lot of original art pieces by Alexander Calder, and then it was the mural in the house was reproduced almost full scale. A lot of miniature sculptures by Norman Carlberg. So this was very kind of professional. I'm not saying this is not professional, but it was very kind of museum-like exhibition, and the advantage was that a lot of original art pieces are available in Sydney. And this is already a traveling exhibition in the same format it's shown here in Barcelona, so this is in Vienna. And this was a special event called Expanded Architecture Exhibition, when local curators in Australia and Sydney decided to invite artists and ask them to do installations inside of 3 Harry Siedler buildings. And all of these buildings are very close to each other. So in one evening, there was this kind of citywide event when a crowd of art lovers would go from one building to the next, and artists presented their works for just one night. And there's going to be a publication of that. And this is the last slide. This is a famous Secession building in Vienna, and it's a famous quote: "To each time it's art, to art it's freedom." It's the most, it's the favorite quote by Harry Siedler, which really reflected his philosophy. And again, to finish it, I want to say that there were perhaps 2 things that you can learn from Siedler. One is his inspirations, his kind of determined vision on finding inspirations, endless inspiration in art, which I think is very, very crucial today, because architects are very, very timid right now, as you may know. Everything has to be explained, everything has to be rational, everything has to be economical. And then you come to places like Barcelona and you see buildings by Gaudi and you just, you wonder, why do people love his buildings? Probably not because they are the most rational buildings in the world. But anyway, and the second idea is to learn from him as a kind of very active person who had a very active position, who was a missionary of modern art and modern architecture and traveled the world constantly meeting people, constantly initiating collaborations. He didn't care where best ideas would come from. He would be willing to work with the best in the world, not just in Australia. And I think that's a huge inspiration for, I guess, younger architects today. And that's it. Thank you so much. If you have any questions. Yes. You have a question?
Sorry. No, very nice conference. The comparison between those sculptors and the architecture of Siedler, very interesting. The relationship between both subjects. I like it, the conference.
Thank you. It's just, I was really surprised that I never heard of him, and when I was kind of embarrassed. I mean, why would I never heard of him? I read so much about architecture. And then when I came back from Australia, I went through my bookshelves in my apartment, and I picked up a number of architectural histories. For example, there is a very famous history of modern architecture by Kenneth Frampton. And I discovered that, my God, he's not mentioned in any of the books that I have. So all of a sudden, I was not ashamed of myself. So he is definitely mentioned in many encyclopedias and in many texts. But at the same time, he is he's kind of not mentioned almost intentionally in a number of key texts that are studied by students around the world, like Kenneth Frampton work. And I cannot forgive it to Kenneth Frampton, because Kenneth Frampton is the author of several books on Harry Siedler. And he knew his work firsthand. He went to Australia, he saw his work. And I asked him, so why didn't you include Harry Siedler in your book? history of 20th century. And he couldn't really tell me. He said that it was a terrible oversight. But I think if you look at the work of Harry Siedler, it seems like it's very hard with critics to deal with him because he was such an unusual figure. It's very difficult to put him into a particular camp of architects because he changed his work dramatically from decade to decade. In the very beginning, he was not distinguished by anything. He was working pretty much in the paradigm of the work of Breuer and a number of others like Gropius, but mainly Breuer. And it was not before, I don't know, 10, 15 years after that that he started searching for his own ideas. And anyway, if you look at any of his work, it never became totally independent. In every single building, you can see someone else there. And it's difficult for critics to say that, because critics are looking, critics are now criticizing star architecture and signature architecture, but that's exactly what they're looking for. If you don't have a signature, you're not in their book. So it's very hard to distinguish what's his signature. If he had a dozen or 15 different influences, what is it that's his? How did he contribute? But at the same time, if you look at his work, throughout his career, you do recognize them as Harry Siedler. But again, his influence very often was not indirect or abstracted. It was very often quite literal that he took from Stella or Breuer or Karlberg. And for example, if you look at the work of such modernists as Jørn Utzon, you never see the direct, where the idea came from. You don't see it. You see Utzon in every single building. You see Alta in every Alta building. It's hard to pinpoint where the idea came from. But in Siedler's work, you can immediately see came from a painting of Frank Stella, or it came from, and that, I think that's, and also many architects, when they start their career, they reinvent architecture. That's what happened to Richard Meyer, that's what happened to Daniel Libeskind, to a lot of architects, like Peter Eisenman. And then it becomes kind of manifesto project, and it pushes the rest of the career. So it's very easy for critics to say, okay, this is a new direction, this is a new word, this is a new hand. But Siedler did a number of projects based on someone else's work. And then he changed, and then he changed again, and then he changed again. And it's very unusual. But at the same time, if you look at his career, you can learn so much about the history of the 20th century. You can learn about history of 20th century art, because his life touched so many careers and institutions and countries and cultures, and that's incredible.